Nice, I like that. My name is Cleve Corner. I'm the manager of author and speaker engagement here at the Pratt. Thank you so much for coming out on this beautiful evening. That joke is 2 weeks running now. It's just like it's hot, right? Yeah. So Thomas is going to speak for about 45 minutes, 50 minutes, and then we'll have time for your questions. We have an audience watching at home. In the future, if you can't make it to a Pratt event, just know 90% of our programs stream live on our YouTube page and our Facebook page. We also archive them there. So if you can't make it, you can definitely check it out online. Because that audience is online, we want them to hear the questions. So when you do have a question, if you do, there's a mic there and there's a mic there. So during the Q&A portion, if you wouldn't mind getting up and going to the microphone, we'd appreciate it. After the program, we'll bring Thomas out and he'd be happy to sign your books. Our bookseller, Greedy Reads, our bookselling partner, Greedy Reads, is here to sell you a said book, and so you can get it signed. This evening, I'm happy to welcome Thomas Dolby to the Pratt Library to discuss his novel, Prevailing Wind. As dark political clouds gather over Europe, the NYYC's railroad barons control the USA from the squeaky leather couches of the 44th Street clubhouse. Far from the immigrant slums, the Suffragettes, and the Ludlow massacres, they wager small fortunes and pit their egos on their favorite distraction, big yacht sail racing. Its absolute pinnacle is the America's Cup, the oldest trophy in world sport. For two penniless brothers, it's a chance of a lifetime to get the heck out of Deer Isle and etch their names in Cup history. But they'll have to fight for places with their rival West Bay crew. There are old feuds to be settled on and off the water. Prevailing Wind is a ruthless exploration of the vast chasm between rich and poor in the progressive age. It is laced with breathtaking depictions of classic yacht racing moments and deep insights into the hearts and minds of working sailors and millionaire owners. The list of breakthrough innovations in Thomas Dolby's 35-year career is continuous. As an early MTV icon, he blazed a trail for electronic music with his imaginative videos. The same year as his own record reached the top of the pop dance charts, he co-wrote and produced the first ever platinum-selling rap 12-inch single, Magic's Wand by Houdini. His synth playing and production have graced the recordings of Foreigner, Def Leppard, George Clinton, and Joni Mitchell, earning 5 Grammy nominations. He appeared live with Stevie Wonder and Herbie Hancock, with David Bowie at Live Aid, and with Roger Waters at the Wall in Berlin. In his self-pen, She Blinded Me with Science became a top 5 Billboard hit, going on to become an evergreen geek anthem of the 1980s that still pops up in Grand Theft Auto, The Big Bang Theory, and Breaking Bad. Thomas has created original music for feature films produced by George Lucas, Steven Spielberg, and Ken Russell. He has appeared with The Muppets. Buried the lead. And on numerous TV shows, from Soul Train to The Late Show. Sought after as a consultant for tech startups and research companies, Dolby seemed to have a hand in every emerging entertainment platform, from laserdiscs and computer games to interactive TV, virtual reality installations, and location-based entertainment. His name is on multiple US patents, and he has worked as an investment advisor for top venture capital firms. During the early Silicon Valley internet explosion, Thomas founded high-tech startup Beatnik Inc. and co-created the code that drove interactive audio in Java. When mobile phones began to play polyphonic ringtones, it was via his BAE technology, which Beatnik licensed to phone manufacturers to be embedded in over 2 billion cellular phones and devices. Between adding music to the mix as in-house music director for every TED conference from 2001 to 12, Thomas taught himself to be a digital filmmaker. In 2013, he won multiple awards for his groundbreaking film, The Invisible Lighthouse, which chronicles the closure of a 250-year-old lighthouse visible from his coastal home in Suffolk, UK. Since fall 2014, Thomas has held the post professor of music for new media at Johns Hopkins University's Peabody Institute. He is also the author of the best-selling memoir, The Speed of Sound. It's my great pleasure to welcome Thomas Dolby to the Pratt Library.
Hello, good evening, and thank you, Cleve, for that glowing introduction. Was anybody here for the soiree that I did with my Peabody students a couple of months ago? We did an Edgar Allan Poe film with live music. Okay, good, that's good to know. Was anybody been to my music concerts? Okay, all right, that's a decent number. A couple were there last night. Okay, that's good. Okay, yeah. So, as you can tell, I'm a guy that's worn many hats over my lifetime, and tonight I'm wearing hair for the first time in 30 years, and it's a miracle of science. And writing historical fiction is a brand new thing for me. I wrote a memoir in 2017 called The Speed of Sound, which was relatively easy. It was really stories that I'd told 1,000 times anyway, and it was just a case of getting them down on paper. I went to my agent with the idea of writing a historical fiction novel, and she sort of rolled her eyes and said, well, you can have a go at that. It's not that hard. She lied. It was extremely hard, especially because the historical background for the book that I chose is one that it would be easy to skim over a lot of the details, but I wanted to write something authentic for those 100, 200 people in the world that would truly understand it. And maybe for the rest of you, create an interesting backdrop for a great universal story. I feel that historical fiction fans tend to be happy to be educated up to a point about a subject they don't know about. I mean, who knew about cathedral building in the 13th century, or about, the run up to World War II and the French Resistance? We didn't, but we're happy to be informed about that, so long as the story is something universal. So I decided to write what I know, and aside from music, my number one passion in life is sailing. In fact, I sail in Baltimore and Annapolis. I sail down here in the harbor, those pretty little J-22s you see floating around on a Thursday night. I'm probably in one of those. A couple of my sailing friends are here tonight. My skipper, I better behave. And I own a classic wooden sailboat of my own in the UK, and my wife and I have a boat on the river there that we usually go back to this time of year. This year has been a bit different because I'm in the middle of a concert tour all around the USA, and I played last night in DC at the Anthem. It's a beautiful venue, couple 3,000 people there. A lot of fun to play in front of that size audience, but I also do sort of smaller shows on my own where I unpack the songs a little bit more and so on. And I've kept my music up, but I haven't released anything in a number of years. I decided a few years ago that what I really wanted to do was sort of pass on the knowledge that I gained to the next generation. When I left school at 16, qualified, there was no college degree for me in the UK that matched my interests. There was nothing in experimental music, avant-garde film, anything like that. And so I skipped college and just sort of basically went out there on the road and became a professional musician. And I got very lucky. By the time I was 21 or 22, and I'd attracted a lot of industry attention, so that when I started doing my solo stuff, the industry was behind me, and they elevated me to that elite group who get full record company support. And there are only about, it's hard to imagine nowadays, but there are about 50 artists per month from which you could choose your new record that you'll go and buy. I mean, today there's tens of thousands every day of new artists, and they're virtually free. It's just like a spigot that you turn on and off. So very different, sort of very rarefied times. And many of my friends and colleagues, by the time they hit, the late 20s, they'd given up music, got real jobs, wanted to be able to afford a car or a mortgage or to get married. And I just felt incredibly lucky to be one of the ones that got hired. And but I very quickly lost interest in the music industry and found it a little bit sort of suffocating. Led to my interest in technology, and then later things like filmmaking. I've always looked for ways to express myself, which involves some new learning of skills on my part. And I love diving into something where I don't really know what the heck I'm doing. I've got no right to be there. I never read the manual, the user manual. I just sort of dive in and start making stuff. And I especially love emerging technologies that nobody has yet identified what the right way to use it is. And I love being one of the first artists to go in there and express myself with the new technology. And so that sort of brings me round to writing. I'd never attempted fiction before. I'm not a massive reader, you know, I'm probably, you know, average, I would think, you know, that I think years go by and I'll only read a couple of books, and then other periods I'll sort of whip off a few in a month. But I'm not a big time reader, and I enjoy it, but I tend to get distracted by, you know, the new thing, electronics, whatever. So in a lot of ways, I felt like a bit of a fraud having a go at fiction. And I decided that I would use this backdrop for myself of what I know, which is classic boat racing. And I decided to pick a particular moment in history when everything came together for me and created the perfect storm for the story that I wanted to tell. So I'm going to briefly sort of run you through the backdrop here, which is the history and the evolution of big yacht racing. I don't want to get too, you know, bogged down in it because, as I say, the story itself is sort of more universal, but it is a fascinating subject. And I'm going to tell you about the heroes and the villains of the piece and explain why I chose 1914 as the year in which my novel would take place. So when I was a kid, my Aunt Marjorie, who was a big-time suffragette in her day and a champion of women's healthcare and contraception, battle axe of a Victorian lady, she had a coffee table book in her house called Beacon of Cows. And Beacon was an early photographer who was focused on the massive sailboats that sailed around the Isle of Wight. Frank Beacon was his name, and it's kind of curious that he's got that thing in his mouth, but I guess the camera was so heavy that to actually snap the picture, it's best to do it with your teeth. That's something he invented. And he and subsequent generations of Beacons over the years photographed these magnificent yachts for their splendor and the scale on which they are built. And they took many of them 35 or 40. Were mostly owned by incredibly posh people in England, dukes and earls and kings and so on. And typically in the US, millionaire, robber barons, factory owners, mining magnates, and so on. And especially Beacon loved to photograph the America's Cup series. So I'm going to sort of zip through like a little backgrounder for the America's Cup, because it was first fought in 1851, and it's going to be contested again this fall in Barcelona in 2024 in a very different kind of boat. So a big difference between these schooners in 1851 and the high-speed hydrofoiling boats that you'll see in Barcelona this year. So starting out in 1951, Queen Victoria had commissioned the Great Exhibition in the UK. And as part of that, she invited a yacht race around the Isle of Wight, which is an island off the south coast of Britain. And this has since become an annual thing that you have a race around the Isle of Wight. But she set up a prize of 100 guineas and created the 100 Guinea Cup. And as a part of that, she invited an American boat to come and compete with the British boats. Nobody thought the Americans had any sort of a chance at this, you know. Their boats had an odd design that we didn't really understand. Many of them were New York Harbor pilot boats. They looked very different to ours. And it was just sort of generally assumed, you know, as one does, that those colonials, you know, didn't really have a clue when it came to designing and sailing yachts. So the Yacht America was sent over by the New York Yacht Club, commissioned by 5 extremely wealthy New York Yacht Club owners. And she had been successful in the USA as a New York pilot, but also as a racing yacht. The racing scene was not as strident in the USA at this point as it was in Europe, where it's very much an aristocratic thing. But it was a big betting venue. In fact, it attracted higher wagering than horse racing or boxing. This is really before baseball and football sort of took off in a big way. It was the biggest betting venue of any sport. And it was spectacular. And when there was a race on, people would absolutely crowd the banks. They would get on boats, they pay, to get a ticket on a steamboat. They would go out in rowboats or canoes or whatever, and they get out on the harbor, and there were bands playing and there were flags waving and a lot of merriment and obviously betting going on. So the schooner America came over in 1851 to be the only foreign boat to take part in this 100 Guinea Cup. And in those days, a little bit different from today, you'd actually start a race on your mooring. So all of the boats are out in the water, tied up to a mooring, and a gun would go, but only when the gun went could you untie from the mooring and sail off. And the American boat was sort of placed at the back of the fleet. It's like, well, that's the only mooring buoy we have available for you lot, so you can start there. But proceeded to sail past 18, I think it was 18 British boats, and get to the front of the fleet and be the first around the Isle of Wight by a long way. And Queen Victoria and Prince Albert were on their steam yacht at the finish, and she was informed that the American boat was going to win the race. And she said, well, who's going to come second? And somebody said to her, madam, there is no second. So that's sort of become a catchphrase of the America's Cup. So following that, the New York Yacht Club created what we now know as the America's Cup, and the deed of gift, which was a set of conditions that went along with the awarding the cup. Among those conditions were things like any challenging boat had to sail to the race venue on her own bottom. She couldn't be towed by any other vessel, so you had to sail there yourself. And the courses that were fought and any judging that needed to take place was entirely in the hands of the New York Yacht Club. So if there was a judging panel required, then they would put together a panel of their members and they would decide the outcome. And the design limitations of the boat, which changed a lot over the years, were also set by the New York Yacht Club. So between 1851 and, say, 1983, the New York Yacht Club retained the America's Cup. It's the oldest trophy on the planet, oldest sporting trophy on the planet. And it was basically riveted to a plinth in the New York Yacht Club's clubhouse on 44th Street in New York for all of that time. And it was only in 1983 that America finally lost it. Since then, it's become a lot more of a level playing field. And I'll sort of explain that a little bit. Known as the Old Mug. Some of the early challenges for the America's Cup were very droll. For example, in 1887, Lieutenant and Mrs. Hen challenged, the British lieutenant challenged for the America's Cup in their yacht Galatea, which they also lived on, as it happened. And Galatea used to tow her own tender, her own little boat behind her wherever she went, and had a fireplace, a tiger skin rug, a grand piano, and an entourage that included a chimp called Peggy, who would help pull up the sails. Not a terribly serious challenge, and they got more serious over time. In 1893 and 95, this chap that I'm going to return to later because he features in my story, was the Earl of Dunraven, Wyndham Thomas Wyndham Quin, the 4th Earl of Dunraven and Mount Earl and Viscount Adair. Why somebody would have the name Wyndham in their name twice, spelt differently, I don't know, but there you are. The designs were not always successful. They were evolving very fast. They were getting faster and more fragile, more flimsy. The sails and the sail area were getting bigger. There were a number of sort of missteps in the design, but it was only really towards the end of the 19th century that the design got a bit more focused. And in particular, Nathaniel Herreshoff of Bristol, Rhode Island became really the premier yacht designer in the world. On the other side of the Atlantic, there were people like William Fyfe and Nicholson and so on. But his Herreshoff's designs were really the prime ones. He had the advantage that he was building a boat that only had to sail in New York or Newport, didn't have to come across the Atlantic. So this, for example, was Resolute, and Resolute was so fragile that big waves would put dents in her hull. And at the end of the America's Cup series, she was basically junked because you couldn't cruise on her. You know, there was nothing below decks. It wasn't a comfortable boat. And there were no other boats that could compete with her for racing. So they were designing these yachts that were basically disposable yachts to be thrown away at the end of the series. As the series evolved, as the designs evolved, the 1930s were probably the classic era for America's Cup racing. The J class was the class of the time, and the J class had a boom called a Park Lane boom, so called because two people could walk arm in arm along it. Took at least 35 men to sail it, and Harold Vanderbilt was really the predominant sailor. This is Harold Vanderbilt of the Vanderbilts. Now, he was second in line to inherit the Vanderbilt railroad fortune. He wasn't really interested in the railroads or business at all. He was interested in sailing and horse racing and playing bridge. In fact, he invented modern contract bridge. And he was a very scientific sailor. He was the first person to really bring sort of mathematical formulae into racing. And he came up with something called the Vanderbilt start that is, still used today, but a formula. His chief adversary was Tommy Sopwith, who is a British aerospace designer, aircraft designer that designed biplanes and so on for the Second World War. But he beat them all with his yachts 3 times. And so he won 3 times in the 1930s. In World War II came along and big yacht racing was really falling out of favor. Nobody really had the money to put together a syndicate to fund these yachts anymore. And obviously during World War II, it fell off altogether. And when it came back afterwards, it was on smaller yachts that were cheaper to build, and you could race them in multiple series and so on, the 12-meter yachts. But happily, there is now a resurgence in the J-class yachts. There are 3 of the original 1930s yachts still around, and another, I think, 6 or 7 clones, where basically somebody went back to the original design of a 1930s J-class yacht and made a repro version of it. And so the modern equivalent of those New York Yacht Club billionaires, the Jeff Bezoses of the world, go out and race these yachts now. And they will be in Barcelona as well, racing. And I was lucky enough to race on one of these at the St. Bart's Bucket a few years ago, and it was an amazing experience. You can see from the scale here just how massive they absolutely were. It was a splendid experience. So anyway, post-World War II, Ted Turner, Dennis Conner, the Australians came in with a scary design of a winged keel and a bronzed boat, and a lot of skullduggery ensued. Divers going down at night and photographing each other's keels, and everything was under tarpaulins, and a lot of skullduggery came about. Dennis Conner was a very successful America's Cup skipper. He won it 3 times, and then in 1983 he actually lost it. He was the first American to lose the America's Cup after 130-something years. Very sad. I think the interest in the America's Cup in this country waned a little bit after that. Interestingly, and I'm always attracted to the sort of, the seamy underbelly of this stuff, he was actually winning until the last race. And he went around the last mark and mysteriously chose to sail off to the less windy part of Newport Sound, allowing the Australian boat to get past him and win the race, and therefore the series. 2 weeks later, after he lost the America's Cup, there was a new challenge against Australia from none other than the San Diego Yacht Club, with Dennis Conner as the head of the syndicate. I'm not saying anything, right? I'm just, So there followed a period where there was a real mismatch of different yachts, where the rules were very unclear. There was a lot of litigation between the different parties. The deed of gift was brought into question, was held up in court. People were questioning about it. And the biggest mismatch of these was in 1988, when there was a giant monohull from New Zealand racing against a far sleek multi-hull catamaran from the USA, and there was really no contest. Larry Ellison, the founder of Oracle, came in 2010 and actually sported a trimaran and won very easily in that one. So, but Larry Ellison, with his involvement, he didn't like the fact that people had said he was basically cheating by coming up with this super fast design, and so he got very involved in the whole industry around yacht racing, and he decided it needed to be a more even playing field. So from 2013 onwards, that was in San Francisco, up to 8 or 9 nations were allowed to compete for the Cup. There was a sort of round robin series, ending up with a single challenger against the holder. That was fought in 2013, and then in Actually, that's wrong. 2013, I should say. USA had an amazing series in San Francisco, and they were actually 8-1 races down, and one more victory for New Zealand would have won them the cup. And they proceeded to win the next 8 races. And it's a comeback, a sports comeback of the like of which, if you wrote that in a Hollywood script, somebody would say, nah, it's too implausible. It's like, don't be ridiculous. But it happened. So a lot of people ask me, so the current boats that you'll see racing if you watch this in Barcelona can sail faster than the wind. And people think this is kind of, a lot of people don't really understand why boats have to zigzag. Why can't you just point where you want to go and go? And you sort of explain to them, well, you can't sail straight into the wind. You also can't really sail straight against the wind, a downwind, away from the wind, because if you have a wind speed of, 12 miles an hour, the fastest your boat can physically go is 12 miles an hour. But you can sort of slide across the wind and you can build speed until you're actually sailing faster than the wind. And this sort of seems ridiculous, but if you think about a leaf blowing, or you think about seabirds, the way they can just hover and make it upwind, they're able to do this using a phenomenon called apparent wind. And a good way to visualize this is actually, if you think of a surfer, right? So that wave is moving maybe 3-4 miles an hour, but the surfer is actually doing 12-15 miles an hour because he goes sideways. So the distance that he has to cover in a given period of time is actually more than the speed of the wave itself. So that's sort of one way to look at it. So as a consequence, modern boats, if you have a true wind of 10 knots, you can actually build apparent wind and get your boat speed up to maybe 25 knots or even 30 knots. So that's how they're able to sail faster than the wind. The other major leap in technology is hydrofoils. And hydrofoils are these sort of carbon blades that go into the water. They've had them on motorboats for decades, on some ferries, high-speed ferries, things like that. It basically enables the boat to lift out of the water so that the surface of solid that is touching the water is very, very small. And these designs have evolved very, very rapidly to the point where in a modern race, 100% of the entire race is done out of the water. So it looks kind of bizarre. It sort of looks like they're flying over the water. And a lot of people just, if they're channel surfing and they stop on this, they might assume there's some sort of motors down there. They've got some propellers on there, that are making go so fast. But no, these boats are able to do 40 knots in a 10-knot wind. It's insane. They're much small. They're huge, but they have much smaller crews. They have 5 or 6 crews, and the rules are always changing as to nationalities of the crews. I forget what the current ruling is, but the current ruling says that the majority of your crew have to be from the nation that is actually competing. But many of the boats have a foreign skipper. Jimmy Spittle is sailing for the Italians. We've got an Australian sailing for the USA these days. And the tech has evolved rapidly. You now have these aircraft wing-sized sails that they sail with. You might see people cycling on board the boats. They're not actually propelling the boat like one of those little, those little tubs in the park that you go on. They're actually pumping up hydraulics that help move the wings and the sails around.
It may look a little Flintstones, but there's nothing Stone Age about Team New Zealand's new America's Cup challenger.
So the Kiwis go to foil as they make the turn at gate number 3. Look at the acceleration and a big dip. Goodness. And
so
it goes over the side. The rescue boat will be there.
Given the speed that they're traveling at, the risk is enormous. I mean, there haven't been any serious head-on collisions, touch wood, so far, but the combined speed could be 100 miles an hour. And they're surrounded by carbon fiber. There's a potential for, for something really terrible to happen. Touch wood, they're very high tech, and they have sort of radar, alerts and things like that. So there've been sort of side to side collisions quite often, but nothing head on so far. So we're just hoping that never happens. But a British sailor called Andrew Simpson was killed in 2013 during the San Francisco series when he got trapped underneath a boat when it capsized. And since then, they have all sorts of flotation and breathing devices. They're trained. The sailors are held underwater in swimming pools, for an event exactly like this. And so they're being very, very careful, as is the case with, Grand Prix driving and so on. The starts are absolutely crucial. The TV coverage these days is fantastic. They superimpose graphics on the water, so you can see the direction the boats are going in, what the sort of distances are between the boats, and so on. And there's a big effort, big collective effort to make this into a serious TV viewing sport. They're pushing very hard. I don't know whether they consider that they're succeeding, but with each successive America's Cup, they're trying to get it up there. There've been Netflix series and so on. There's an ongoing contest called Sail GP, which is sort of like F1. It's based on Formula One racing, and they go around the world. They have 12 or 14 different regattas in different cities, and it just ended up in San Francisco yesterday. Spanish won, amazing. Beat out the Australians and the New Zealanders, but who are really the predominant nations in fast yacht racing these days. So that was a big success for the Spanish. Okay, so in Barcelona this fall, the America's Cup will be contested for the 37th time. Britain has an entry from Sir Ben Ainslie, who, despite being a very highly decorated Olympic sailor, has never had much luck himself at the helm of an America's Cup boat. He was on the American boat in 2013, Larry Ellison's boat, when they won that. So he considers, or he's viewed as an America's Cup winner, but he's never done it at the helm himself. So this is probably his last hurrah. So I'm really hoping that Ben wins it. So that's the sailing portion done. Okay, I just wanted to give you the backdrop. And if there are serious sailors here, I know there are some, but they can always grab me and ask me questions. And some of them know a lot more than I do, I suspect, about this stuff and about racing in general. So now I want to get on to why, out of all of this, I picked one particular era and period to write my book. I want to go back to this guy, the Earl of Dunraven. So the Earl of Dunraven owned vast tracts of land in Ireland, and he was a sportsman. He was a heck of a dandy. He wore a monocle in one eye. He had top London tailors from Savile Row design all of his outfits, and he spent a lot of time in New York, where he would go to the Metropolitan Opera. Every time he showed up with a new floral waistcoat, the next week, all of the young men in New York would have their tailors copy it. He was adored in New York society, and in fact, he had gout, and he went to the opera one night with a bandage on his foot and holding a walking stick with a big emerald in the handle. Next week, guess what happens? Everybody shows up with a bandage on their foot and a walking stick with an emerald. So he's absolutely adored. And in 1893, he competed for the America's Cup with his boat, Vagrant 2. And he failed, didn't succeed. 2 years later, he came back with a bigger, faster boat, which was very highly rated against the American boat, which is called Defender. And there was a huge fanfare around this in New York Harbor. Lots of spectator boats. It's like a massive spectator event at that point. They went out on New York Harbor close to the Statue of Liberty to start their races. Just the two boats, just Dunravens against the American Defender boat from the New York Yacht Club. And right before the start of the first race, there was an incident that happened which resulted in the two boats coming together instantaneously. And in the process of this, the American boat was damaged, and one of her topmast stays snapped. So her topmast was actually wonky, and she fell behind. And Dunraven got a great start after this, sailed off around the race and came first. But the American boat protested because they had the right of way at the time. They were what's called the downwind boat. So they were able to push Dunraven's boat up into the wind, and Dunraven had to stay clear, and he didn't. Well, he claimed that he was impeded deliberately by a New York spectator boat, and so he had no choice but to swerve around it, and that's why he hit the American boat, and so he should be allowed to carry on. And the American skipper, Oliver Iselin, offered to re-sail the race, but Dunraven was too proud for that and said, no, we're going to beat you fair and square. We'll carry on with the series. I accept my disqualification. I'm 1-0 down. I'm going to come back tomorrow and beat the pants off you. So the next day he came back. It was a bit windier. And for no apparent reason, right after the starting gun went, Dunraven turned his boat around and sailed back to the docks, got off and hopped on the next steamship back to Liverpool, England. Nobody could figure out why. When he got back to England, he said, the Americans cheated. He put out a pamphlet and he did an interview with Field magazine. And he said this. He said that during the night after the first race, the American boat added additional ballast. So to keep a boat upright, especially in a heavy wind, going upwind, you want weight in the bottom of the boat, the lower the better, to stop it from tipping over so you keep the maximum sail area. So he claimed that during the night, people had gone aboard and added pig lead to the American boat. And why did he know this? Because the next day, a couple of his guys took a rowboat around the American boat and they noticed the waterline. You know, the boat was sitting lower in the water. In fact, some of the pipes and holes you could see were no longer visible because clearly the boat was lower in the water. Well, this accusation was like a slap in the face. I mean, 50 years earlier, it would have been pistols at dawn, right? And he'd made it public, and the New York Yacht Club were absolutely disgusted by this. And Oliver Iselin felt that his personal honor had been besmirched and so on. So they decided to call together a tribunal, as was their right. And they put together a tribunal of mostly American panelists from the New York Yacht Club, a couple of local pilots and so on. And they decided to investigate this. And they invited Dunraven to come. So he came back to New York with his attorney, and they held the hearing. And they sent for 12 of the original sailors that were on the crew of the American boat, who came from Deer Isle, Maine. And they were sent on a private train from Deer Isle, Maine, back to New York. And one by one, they stood up, hand on Bible, and testified there was no pig lead brought on the boat overnight. Case closed. And midway through the tribunal, Dunraven gets up. What does he do? He catches the next steamship back to England. So he went from hero to zero almost overnight in the USA. And now the newspapers were saying, well, he's just a sour loser. You know, it's like he knows his beat. He's just coming up with an excuse for this. So much for the British fair play and good sportsmanship. The guy is just like a, nasty, bad loser. And the Earl of Dunraven gave up yachting after that. And he moved to Colorado and opened a safari lodge and co-wrote a book about spiritualism and Ouija. And that was the end of it. And after this incident, the America's Cup would have gone out the window, really. The public were losing interest in it, were it not for a guy called Sir Thomas Lipton. Sorry, I should have shown you this earlier. This is a depiction of the event that led to the disqualification. So Sir Thomas Lipton came up with a new design. And Sir Thomas Lipton, who's the tea guy, right? Those tea bags and everything. And at the time, he had a chain of tea houses. He was a British aristocrat. He was from working class background, but he had become very successful in the UK as a businessman. For a long time, he wasn't allowed into the Royal Yacht Squadron because he wasn't quite posh enough. But he funded 5 successive America's Cup challenges, and he lost every one of them. The last was in 1930 against Harold Vanderbilt. But in 1913, it was announced that he was challenging for the America's Cup to take place in 1914 in the summer. So he had a new design, and it was going to sail across the Atlantic, accompanied by his steam yacht Erin, which is a big steam yacht. And the Americans held a challenge series of 3 yachts in Newport and in New York. And out of those, they were going to choose the American yacht that would represent the New York Yacht Club and defend against the challenge. And in early August 2014, his boat Shamrock 4 was halfway across the Atlantic, accompanied by the steamship Erin, when they got a radio message that World War I had broken out in Europe and England had declared war on Germany, and that the steamship Erin was commissioned to requisitioned to return to the UK to be used as a hospital ship. And the Shamrock, which was what you call jury rigged with like a half-size mast and all of her gear on the deck, which had no engine, was told to report to the closest British Navy base, which was St. George's, Bermuda. And Bermuda is 640 miles from New York, so it's very close to New York. But its chaperone, Erin, had to go back to the UK, so they were going to be marooned there. Well, this was terrible news for the New York Yacht Club people. They weren't in the war yet. They were very disappointed at not being able to run the series. And it's very bad news for Lipton as well, because he was a fabulous marketer and he had all sorts of plans for how he was going to market his new tea houses, you know, during the race. So it's very bad news. But he was patriotic and he understood that he had to do the right thing for the war effort. So the rear commodore of the New York Yacht Club at the time was Harold Vanderbilt. He was still pretty young. He was 28, 29 years old. And he had a beautiful Herreshoff-designed schooner called Vagrant II, which had engines and all sorts of geeky devices on it, because he was a bit of a geek. It even had a submarine detection device called a Fessenden oscillator. And so his boat had all sorts of cool devices, and he offered to sail his schooner to Bermuda to accompany Shamrock back into New York Harbor to be put up in dry dock until the war was over. And they all thought it would be weeks or months at most before the war was over. So Harold Vanderbilt sails to Bermuda. When he gets there, there was a terrible fog around Bermuda, and Bermuda is surrounded by reefs. And they'd taken down all the navigation buoys because of the war. So he had to find his way into St. George's Harbor, just sort of using old-fashioned methods. He wasn't allowed to use his underwater detector device because there was a risk that he would alert some German U-boat and get sunk. So after that, the news that you can research becomes a little bit blurry because World War I. Right. So if you go in the New York Times archives, you look at any of the yachting magazines, any of the sources you would go to, after August 1914, it's very, very hard to do any further research. So I was fascinated by this situation. And I thought, okay, if you've ever sailed, you know that there's no time when two sailboats are going alongside each other that it isn't a race. So I rather loved the idea of these two millionaires' yachts making their way back from Bermuda on the 640-mile journey and what would ensue. So that was basically where my story began. This was the germ of the idea, was that this moment was a fascinating moment, and that I had a little bit of leeway, artistic leeway, because there was not very much actual fact available about what was going on at that time. So this is where the fiction part of the historical fiction came in. The other thing that I knew about my story was that I didn't want it to be just about the millionaires. Some of them, I think Harold Vanderbilt was a wonderful guy, but there are Carnegies and Rockefellers and Morgans and so on who, you know, have a bit of a sort of shady past. And if you dig a bit deeper beyond their Wikipedia bios, which of course have been whitewashed over the years, you find that they were not very nice people. You think about the context of what was going on at the time. And these guys collectively, the membership of the New York Yacht Club, were actually in possession of more wealth and power than the US government and the US Treasury at the time. And they had this magnificent clubhouse on 44th Street where they would hang out, and it was an old boys club, basically. And they were able to make decisions about the country in the future from the sort of squeaky leather armchairs of the 44th Street clubhouse. It has these gorgeous galleon-style windows and the most amazing model room. The whole block of it is like basically built of half-hull ship models buried in the walls like the ribs of dinosaurs in a quarry. It's just the most amazing place. But the crews that they needed to sell these yachts, and remember I told you it took 35, sometimes 40 men to sell these crews. They were not other New York Yacht Club members with their soft hands. They were hardy Maine fishermen, lobstermen. So the New York yachtsmen would send up to Maine to recruit their crews. And the Maine lobstermen were incredible sailors. They had leathery hands already. They worked really well together as a team. They were used to sailing fast because if you have a fishing boat or lobster boat, you need to be first back to market to set the price for your catch. So they knew all of the tricks of the trade, even though it wasn't necessarily yacht racing. And they were cheap, especially in years when the fishing was bad. You could get them for, a few bucks a month. And then finally, they were churchmen. So at night, they would lay in their hammocks and read their Bibles instead of going out drinking on the town. So ideal, absolutely ideal. And this was the 1895 Defender crew, who were the same crew that had been sent from Deer Isle to go and testify against Dunraven and Vagrant. So in 1913, 1914, there were immigrants pouring into the USA. But there were horrible things going on in industry and a very tense time between employers and workers. There was a tragic fire at the Triangle shirt factory. 60-something women were killed because they were they were locked into a room in bad conditions and there was no safety measures. In Colorado, women and babies were slaughtered at the Ludlow massacre. Colorado. Yeah, Colorado. The Rockefellers, who owned the railroads and the mines down there, basically hired an armed militia to go in and flush out the striking workers. And in the process of it, lots of women and babies were killed. In the meantime, you had the suffragettes, you had all sorts of movements taking place, the Wobblies, the early attempts to unionize American workers. You had income tax that had come in for the first time. And the New York Yacht Club resisted this like crazy. They didn't want to pay any income tax. A lot of those big mansions in Newport, Rhode Island, are there because Rhode Island was the last state to actually implement the income tax, which at the beginning was only, 4% or something like that. But they didn't want to pay it. So that's one reason that they bought these. Newport, Rhode Island was a sort of a tax haven. So as all of these immigrants poured in, it just fascinated me that the crews on these yachts were penniless Maine fishermen, and their bosses were multimillionaires with all of this power and influence. And I thought, okay, there's my universal story right there. It's really the relationships and the possible relationships between these Maine lobstermen and their bosses. And this is a painting done by Russ Kramos, one of the foremost contemporary maritime painters. He did the cover of my book, by the way. I commissioned that from scratch, but this is one that he had. And these guys are topmast men, and they had to go up to the very top of these enormous 7-story high masts. And I just loved the idea of these sort of very macho young Maine fishermen who would swing about in the rigging up there, completely fearless. And so that became the background for the characters in my book. So that sort of gives you the setting. 5 years ago, I started this. 6, thank you. Thank you, wifey. The reason it took that long is I have at least one full-time job, if not two, teaching at Peabody and so on. And so I worked, holidays, weekends. When we were back in England, I would work there. And the research needed was massive, right? Because I had to go to all of these locations, like twist my arm, go to Bermuda for a week and explore the back roads, find good locations for the altercation between the two brothers that I needed to take place in a big storm, So you get there and it's always a bit different, I just sort of pictured this like lighthouse on a rocky headland, and there'd be this electric storm going on, and they'd have this altercation at the height of the story. I get there and there is no high rocky land, at Bermuda. There's low rocky land, but I stumbled onto this most amazing former British gunnery, covered in vines and creepers, and it's as if the jungle was trying to swallow it back up. But it had formerly been a gunnery. But at the time it had just been abandoned. So this became the backdrop for for that particular scene. I went to Deer Isle and I got friendly with a local waterman who in his lunch hour rowed me around the harbor and pointed out some of the sites. And I was sort of taking notes of all of this. I got in a boat to go out around Penobscot Bay to Ilaho, I think that's the way to pronounce it, and various other little islands around the bay. And I'm just sort of creating the sort of network of locations and events that was going to happen in my story. I went to the New York Yacht Club, which is fascinating. I was invited there as a guest early on. I've been back since then. Since my book has come out, I may no longer be persona, grata there. Although so far so good. I was there recently, and the greatest contemporary America's Cup historian, a guy called Stephen Sushir, who is like a god at the New York Yacht Club, he'd heard from Russ Kramer, the painter, that my manuscript was coming out, that my novel was coming out. He said, "Oh, I'd really like to read it." I said, "Yes, Steve, yeah, you read it." He said, "No, I would really like to read it." And I took a deep breath and I sent him the manuscript. I thought, let's get this over with. And he said, yeah. 24 hours later, he calls me back. He's just finished the book. And he said, yeah, no, I couldn't put it down. It was fascinating. And I love the depth you've gone into over the sailing. Because, I talked to like old schooner skippers and things about how you actually sail these boats. I mean, I really wanted to do a good job describing what it actually takes to sail these giant yachts. And he was very impressed with that. He said, yeah, but when I got to the page where you said, I'm not going to spoil it, but fill in the blank. He said, that really hurt. And I said, okay. He said, but I'm a historian. And I know that sometimes fiction tells the truth better than the facts do, because the facts have been whitewashed over the years. And sometimes it takes a work of fiction to actually tell things the way they are. He said, and your book is going to raise some eyebrows around here. But let's see how it goes over. And Kathleen and I went there as his guest a couple of months ago, and he was introducing me to everybody under the sun. We were sort of guests of honor. And he sort of said, now, Thomas has written a fascinating novel about the America's Cup in 1914. It's got some controversial points in it, but overall, I think it's really good for us that we've written this. So we'll see how that goes over time. But between the research that I had to do and the writing skills that I had to learn, as I say, it was much, much harder than writing a memoir, which is like, stream of consciousness, to actually construct this thing. And it's a thriller. So with thrillers, it's really tricky. You got to piece together this sort of patchwork of like leaving breadcrumbs and not giving the game away, make sure you don't telegraph the outcome, not having outrageous twists that are going to make people just sort of put it aside and go, well, that's too ridiculous. So that is a whole balancing act, which is sort of ongoing. And again, I love to learn new skills, so I think probably at the beginning I sucked at it. I did a bunch of revisions, got some input from different people, as ever, really careful about the authenticity of the whole thing. I was aware that there may be living survivors of some of the characters in my book, both in Deer Isle and in New York or wherever, and that they wouldn't all be too happy about what I'd written. I had to pick some pariahs who maybe did or didn't deserve it. I tended to pick the ones that I suspected were actually villains. But there are bad guys on both sides. There are evil Deer Isle lobstermen, and there are very nice New York Yacht Club millionaires. I pieced the story together, and to an extent, the thing wrote itself. You create these characters, and they kind of know what they need to do next, and that was really interesting. So there were parts of it that I really wrote stream of consciousness. I just typed anything that came into my mind, and then the next day I would go back and sort of revise it. But I finished it finally earlier this year, and it came out in June on Archway Books. I quickly had to learn another new skill, which is how to game the Amazon algorithm, which is a moving target. But that's obviously vitally important. It's not really, sadly, about bookshops, and solid book sales anymore. It's really about Amazon. My wife used to work in a bookshop, and they would sometimes say, we better send them up the river. Meaning, we don't have this, we can't get it. They might as well just go get it at Amazon. So Amazon is sort of the gargantuan force in the book industry these days. But hey, I don't need a New York Times bestseller. This is obviously a labor of love for me, getting my passion out there and constructing a story that I felt people could relate to, but at the same time being true to the history that there is and the authentic workings of a giant sailing boat. So that's more or less it. We're going to have some questions, and you've been a lovely audience. Thank you for having me.
So we have about 15 minutes for your questions. Again, microphone over there by Sophia, microphone here by me. Again, we have a online audience here, so I'm going to start with an online question while folks come up to the microphone with theirs here in person. Thomas, question from online. What's the greatest difference between writing a book and writing a piece of music?
Writing a book and
Writing a piece of music.
ooh. One of them is my natural medium and the other one definitely isn't. But I think if you work only in your natural medium for your entire life, then you've sort of missed out on some great opportunities to extend, you know, your skill set and find new ways to express yourself. And it stimulates my imagination to be working in a field where I don't know what the heck I'm doing. So I like that. So that's the biggest difference, I think, really. You know, I think that I do a decent job of writing, but it doesn't flow through my veins the way music does. But still, I had a fantastic time doing it. I think if I spent 5 years doing an album or two, you know, I mean, I've made some great albums. Don't need to do that as badly as I need to carry on finding new ways to tell my story. It's all storytelling. I would say that. I say that even when I create songs, when I write the lyrics, very often my lyrics, you know, have a story behind them. Very often the sounds that I pick help provide a sort of a backdrop to the story that I'm telling. It's almost like creating, in either case, it's almost like creating an imaginary movie. And I think this should be a movie, by the way. I'll tell you, it'll be a damn sight easier. It'd be a damn sight easier to explain why those boats have to zigzag up to the start line than with a couple of drone cameras and some good editing and some CGI. It'd be a lot easier than trying to put that in words without sending people to sleep. Yes.
Well, first, I hope your book does get optioned. That would be brilliant. I also want to say thank you for your performance last night. It was absolutely poetic. It was the highlight of my evening in the concert. It was artful and thoughtful and great storytelling with sound. I'm a curator, and I focus my practice on the late 19th century, early 20th. And I had no idea about your book until this morning and found out about this. And then my friend who and I went to the concert last night. We were up till 2 a.m., showed back up for your, I'm so glad we came to this lecture. As a curator, I love digging into archives and finding sources. My question is twofold. What are some of your favorite sources for your book, places where you went to do this deep research? I love New York Historical Society. It's one of my favorite places to dig. But I'm curious about where you went. And the second part of my question is, are you aware of the incredible tradition of log canoeing in Maryland? And have you been to the log canoe races? And if you and your wife haven't been, I'd like to invite you, because one of my dear clients, it has one of the log canoes that races in the race, and always is welcoming people to come and experience log canoeing, which is again a fantastic sailing tradition. So your sources, sir.
Yeah, well, that's great. Well, thank you for coming to the show, and I'm glad you really enjoyed it. I'm sorry for those of you that missed it. It was fun as hell doing that. As far as my sources, I mean, I mentioned a couple. Rowing around Stonington Harbor in Deer Isle was a was a great one. Bermuda was an absolute revelation. I was fortunate to be able to go there at a time when there was racing going on, so I saw a little bit of the America's Cup there. I saw a little bit of Sail GP there. I saw the J classes racing around Bermuda, and I rented a scooter and went around the island in all sorts of crazy weather, looking for locations. And was very pleased with the one that I ended up with. And I absolutely love it there. St. George's in particular is just an amazing place if you ever get a chance to go there. Like a little British naval port, 640 miles into the Atlantic from New York. It's just fantastic. Those primarily, I enjoyed the library at the New York Yacht Club was amazing. When I wrote the story, there's scenes that happen at the New York Yacht Club, and I had to speculate about the back stairs and little nooks and crannies so that people could creep around doing, evil stuff. And this guy, Steve Sashia, is like, he's a real expert on that building. And he, in his multitude of corrections he sent me for my manuscript, he pointed out a few physical issues with my description of the New York Yacht Club. I had the servants' entrance being on 45th Street, and he sent me a photograph from the year of my book in 1914, highlighting where the servants' entrance was actually to the left of the main entrance. And he corrected a few other things, but he said, it doesn't really matter because it's been remodeled a few times over the years. But at about 2 a.m. after his presentation there, I think he had a couple of drinks in him, and he decided to take Kathleen and myself on the back lot tour of the New York Yacht Club, and took us to a few of those nooks and crannies, and that was a gorgeous thing to do as well. So I absolutely loved the research of this. And if I do a sequel, which I hope I will do, which I think is probably going to be about the 1930s, whole other universe. It's like I haven't even scratched the surface of all of the research and background that I would have to do, for that, a whole different era really then. And then lastly, log canoes. Well, the sailing community around here is quite small and tight, so everybody knows everybody. And there's a good friend of mine called James who sail with sometimes, and he's actually the founder of the Charm City Mead Works. He used to drive submarines on the floor of the bay, and now runs a mead works and speaks very slowly. And he goes, Tom, we really need to get you on a log canoe. And he's from an old sort of, East Bay family. And he's said that to me about every year since I've lived here in the last 10 years. And so far it hasn't really happened. But one of these years I'm going to get on one of those things. And I absolutely love they're so ridiculous looking. And I would love to sail on one. And I hope we capsize.
Well, it's so good to finally meet you. I remember reading about your coming here, and I was like, wow, I hope I run across him one day, When you, I was actually thinking, there's such synchronicity where it comes to your artistry, and I'm born and raised here. And I was going to say something like, good heavens, Miss Yakamoto, you're beautiful, when you came in, right? I watched that video so many times, right? But as you've talked, my brain just went all over the place. One of my friends growing up was a sailor. He passed away a few years ago. He's a couple years younger than me. I'm born in '53. And his name's Peter Bascom. His sister actually sang with Stevie Wonder. They were the offspring of the preacher of the church that I grew up in.
Wow.
And as I was listening, I went and bought your book. I was thinking more along the lines of I was going to purchase a biography. But when I saw this and when I listened to you, I was like, I'm going to send this book to Bernadette Bascom so she can kind of revel in it, because her brother would do things like sail to South America and stuff like that. And just a little backstory. I graduated from high school with Gary Mudbone Cooper, who you probably played music with when you were with George Clinton and Parliament Funkadelic. And, it's just another little teeny bit of synchronicity.
All right.
And I got to follow up on that story you were just talking about, this guy that does submarines. That's off the charts. I used to be with the Baltimore City dive rescue team. If I had been working when that bridge went down a few weeks ago, I would have been one of the divers going down
Wow.
there, you know.
Amazing.
So, oh, one last thing. I remember my wife got the Flat Earth from the library back about when you put it out. What was it, about like 88 or something like that?
83.
And give me the inspiration for Mulu, the rainforest, because right around then, I remember being in a state of rapture about that movie, The Emerald Forest. So
Mhm.
can you just kind of explain what was
Yeah,
the
yeah,
inspiration for Mulu?
Yeah. By all means. Well, thanks for your stories. And by the way, you need to send your friend my memoir as well as the novel, because there's some really good Stevie Wonder stories in there. Yeah, Mulu the Rain. So it's actually, no, 84 it came out. This is the 40th anniversary this year, and they're doing a new edition with some extra songs and things like that. So do try and pick that up if you can. Yeah, so there's a song in there called Mulu the Rainforest, and it's pretty weird. I saw that book title in a library, and it just caught my imagination. I knew nothing about it. I'd recently seen a Peter Weir film. I think it was called The Last Wave or something like that. It was basically about an Australian city that I think at the end there was like a deluge, but the original indigenous people whose tribal lands they built the city on had a sort of like a predication, like a vision in advance, like their law said that there was going to be this big flood that was going to wash the city away. And it was something along those lines. I probably haven't got the details right. Anyway, I very often something like that is enough to trigger a new song for me. I love the title. Didn't know much about Mulu. It's actually in Indonesia, I think, the rainforest called Mulu. Then by complete coincidence, when I was recording at the Townhouse Studios in London, I was recording the song, and the receptionist saw the name on the box of tapes and said, "Oh, that book was written by my great uncle." Lord Hanbury Tennyson was an explorer who had gone to Mulu and explored it. And yeah, so it's just one of those nice things that sort of comes around. Yeah,
We
thank
are
you.
running out of time. I want to get these last three questions in, so
Okay,
if they can
I
please
will
be brief.
I will be brief.
Hi, I was just curious, what is your favorite wooden sailboat you've ever seen?
Oh, yeah, I mean, a good question. I love them all, especially when somebody else maintains them. My boat in England, I co-own with a chap, former Navy chap, who loves to maintain boats. So basically, I go over in the summer and smash them up, and in the winter, he fixes them up again. I mean, I absolutely love them. My studio in England is built in a 1933 lifeboat, which I bought on eBay. And we had a truck bring it to the garden, and it was never going to go back in the water again. It's sort of rotten through. But we put it on railroad ties in the garden, and I used the wheelhouse to build a studio with solar panels and a wind turbine on the mast. And I made my last album, which is called The Map of the Floating City. I made it right there in that lifeboat using mainly renewable energy from the roof. So I love that one, but the East Coast wind is whistling through those timbers, and it hasn't got many more years on it, I don't think, unfortunately, but I absolutely love that. But I mean, I think that, so my boat in England is not a huge wooden boat. It's 22 feet, but very elegant. It's a 1930s design, which is still made today, rarely. And where I live in the UK, there's a fleet of about 45 of them. And it's very, very complicated sailing, because it's a narrow river, with shallows in it, strong currents, twisty, and moored boats. So it's very complicated. It's like 3D chess compared to checkers, And nothing against people that do just a windward leeward courses that, like out here in the harbor, which don't vary very much. We do like 4 races of an evening, and it's basically the same course each time. Each course there is completely different depending on the wind direction and the current and all the rest of it. And it is maddening. But I love it so much, and I love the fact that when I'm out there, I just don't think about anything else, and it's just the ultimate escape. I love the history of the boats, and I actually at my peak, I won a regatta in that class against 40 other boats a couple of seasons ago. And it's sort of been, I knew at the time it's going to be downhill from there. And, and this year I'm not even going to get to sail her more than once or twice. So I'd have to say, yeah, and our class is called Loch Long from Scotland, from the Clyde in Scotland. And so I'd have to say that's my favorite wooden boat.
Hi there. I came in with one question, and your presentation brought another one to mind. So I'm going to start with that one. I remember an episode of The West Wing several years ago where a character talked about yacht racing, and he said specifically something about a little piece of kelp sticking to the hull of the boat and what a big deal that was, and how you had to be very careful to get the thing off in order to actually win the race. And I wondered if that sort of thing was in fact a genuinely big deal. The other question I had was, since you have been kicking around Baltimore for about 10 years, do you have any stories in you about the Chesapeake Bay?
Yeah, well, firstly, to the kelp point, I mean, people get very, very finicky about the state of the underside of their boats. It's all about keeping the flow going through the water. And if you think of it like a computer model of, fluid dynamics of the way water flows, if you upset that and you get, weird vortices going on, by yanking the rudder too hard or there's various different ways to do it, turning at the wrong speed, then you upset the flow. And similarly with the flow of air over the sails, so to keep going, sort of like being on an elevator, you can't afford to stop walking up a down elevator or else you'll go backwards. You just got to keep pedal to the metal the whole time. And so people get very, very finicky, and some people haul their boats out after every race, it's to get them cleaned off. A lot of kelp attaches. It's just wildlife. It's just natural. And of course, due to the ecology, we're not allowed to paint them with horrible, toxic materials. You have to use sort of natural materials to discourage things from attaching themselves. But they do. And if you leave your boat in the water for a few weeks, especially here in the harbor, you pull it out and it's all covered in barnacles and kelp and weed and all the rest of it. But savvy sailors, on occasions, sail their boat backwards prior to a race in order to get rid of some of that kelp. And when you read my book, you will understand why that is significant even in 1914.
What about the Chesapeake Bay?
Oh, Chesapeake Bay. I've done limited amounts of sailing in the Chesapeake Bay, to be perfectly honest. Really between here and Annapolis, I've sort of raced, haven't done a lot of cruising. We took a catamaran out a few years ago, which is a lot of fun. It's really sailing, it's sort of like a condo with sails. But it was very nice to be out in the bay and it was gorgeous. And because they're very shallow, you can pull into these little bolt holes and there's bald eagles and you can, jump in and have a swim and everything. So I absolutely love it. I'd love to do more of it, but I'm not usually here in the summer. I'm usually back to England as soon as the Peabody term ends. I'm back in England until it starts up again at the end of August. So I've never really been at liberty to go cruising around the Chesapeake Bay.
I think our last question over here.
All right.
So you've told us about a lot of successes and obviously music, now writing. Tell us about two of your failures.
What failures, right? No, I mean, people don't always click. Music is a very collaborative thing. I've had relationships that have worked great musically and others that on paper should have been just fine and didn't work out. Other than my own music, my favorite band in the world is an English band that nobody has heard of over here called Prefab Sprout. And I produced 2.5 of their albums and just had a sweet relationship with them. And they gave me a free hand, but as a producer, it was really about bringing the best out of them. And this songwriter, Paddy McAloon, is a genius. And it was just my job to sort of put the frame around the painting. Based on listening to a Prefab Sprout album, Joni Mitchell hired me as a co-producer for an album of hers called Dog Eat Dog. And she's astonishing, amazing musician. I adulated her as a kid, and it just didn't work out really. I think she did an interview in Rolling Stone. She said he tried to interior decorate me out of my own home. So that just didn't really pan out, and it's hard to know really. There's different kinds of producers. I think probably the most successful long-term producers are ones who are able to sort of just surrender themselves to the artist's will and resist the opportunity to sort of, you know, intrude and intervene. And I have a hard time doing that. You know, it's like I understand the difference between the role of a producer and the artist. And I think that, especially back in those, I was in my 20s then, you know, it's hard for me to relinquish that power and not make suggestions. And that was probably what rubbed Joni the wrong way. Yeah. So that's really, I'd have a hard time thinking of other favorites. I mean, even things that weren't commercially successful, I see the upside of them. You know, it's like you learn something from them, you do good stuff. I follow my heart and not my pocketbook, really. And I've always made decisions on that basis. And if you do that and you let your guard down and you really express yourself, it doesn't really matter how many you sell, you know, or where you chart or anything like that. And my heroes growing up, I never knew how many copies they sold or, you know, where they ended up in the chart. I mean, some of them are obscure, you know, Dan Hicks or, you know, Frank Zappa or Captain Beefheart or whatever. It really didn't matter. In fact, I rather liked the elite feeling of thinking only a few of us know about Frank Zappa, you know. And I like to think that I have a hardcore of music fans who go, oh my God, you know, it's like I'm one of the few Dolby disciples and we're an elite bunch, but who would want him to be Taylor Swift?
Please help me thank our author, Thomas Dolby. Thank you very much.
The book stock, by the way, was provided by Greedy Reads, who are our local bookstore. We often walk down there to peruse. It's a lovely little bookstore in Fells Point, so you guys should check it out. And they were nice enough to provide the stock for today. So thanks to Greedy Reads, and thanks to Enoch Pratt for inviting me as well, and all of your staff.
Yes, thank you. And I think you can follow your heart and your pocketbook, and you can purchase a book from Greedy Reads. And Thomas will be happy to sign it. We'll be out in about 5 minutes. My colleague Sophia will help with the line if you'd like to get your book signed and talk with Thomas a little longer. Thanks for coming out.
All right.